Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining today. So today's topic is how to subcontract facility laser scanning, and we will jump right in. This is part, as Veronica shared, this is part of our AIA kind of education series we do. A bunch of different classes we teach in it throughout the year. This one is the first one in the series, but we'll repeat other ones at different times over the next few months. Hey, we'll start with just a really quick introduction to PMC, just so you know who we are if you're not familiar. We've been around a long time and we've done lots and lots of projects. We've scanned right around 1 billion square feet over the years. We've been scanning for about 20 years. One of the larger scanning and modeling providers out there. We have offices kind of scattered around the world right now. Some have scanning equipment, some don't, but we do work globally. Right. Then just real quick, couple other things we do. Obviously, what we're talking about today with laser scanning, but we also do industrial engineering, 3D modeling, which we're not going to touch on only a little bit today as it applies. We're working on a separate presentation about contracting modeling services. And then we do simulation and visualization services as well. With that, enough about us. We'll jump right into things. So the presentation's sort of broken down, in these different sections. Going to start with just a little bit about laser scanning, just for those who don't know, to give you some background into how the process works and what to expect from it. Then we'll jump right into the RFQ part of it and the contracting with some pitfalls of bad RFQs and as well as some tips for contracting small and large projects, and then ending with some cost expectations of what you should maybe expect when you get the bids. Obviously, we don't know everyone's numbers, but these are numbers that we think are pretty standard within the industry. Okay. Jump into a little bit about scanning. Okay. So the process really falls into 4 steps, if you will, right? The first one being planning, where we'll plan out the job and we'll schedule everything. Then the on-site scanning. This is where we're actually going to physically show up at the site and capture the data. Once we leave the site, we have to post-process or register the data. This varies a little depending on the type of equipment that was used. And then we have to generate whatever the outputs might be, whether those are just scanning outputs or CAD outputs or analysis outputs. Um, when we're planning out a job, different people will plan these different ways. Different people will ask more questions. If it's a relatively straightforward job, something in commercial, real estate, there's gonna be very few questions other than we need a site contact and we need to know what times we can be there, those types of things. And all that would be covered in a kickoff meeting. As the sites get a little more complicated or have more requirements, expect this to be a little more thorough process. Or we're maybe going to talk about any kind of safety training and things like that that need to be covered. And once we're on site, if we're using traditional scanning, which is still the biggest share of the market, these are scanners that go on a tripod and they run anywhere from 2 to 15 minutes. They capture color as well as black and white scan data at the same time. They say it's just one of the types of scanning that's out there now. There's also mobile scanning and photogrammetry, both of which are gaining traction but are not as common. Um, in general, you could expect on a traditional scanner to capture maybe up to 20,000 square foot a day on site, depending on the complexity of the site. With mobile, that number could be over 100,000 square foot a day. That gives you a ballpark idea of how long we'd be at the site. Right. As projects get larger, certainly anything over, let's say, 100,000 square foot, you should expect to see some targets put up around the space, and they can vary from paper checkerboards that maybe you've seen around to spheres and a number of other things that can be temporarily put into the space. On some jobs, we also install permanent benchmarks. These would be for ongoing scanning. typically either an active construction or a manufacturing site. But most of the time, you're either going to see no targeting at all, or you're going to see temporary targets put up and taken down. And, depending again on the size of the job, as the job gets larger, you're also going to see some traditional surveying equipment show up on site. And this is just to help do control over the accuracy of the data. And this is a very important part when you're bidding large projects that we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to that section is smaller projects, like I say, require no targets at all. Larger projects start to require targets. Very large projects require survey. If you don't do survey on very large projects, your data quality will not be acceptable. As mentioned, after the scanning is done, we need to post-process that data. And again, this varies depending on the equipment that was used. So we'll talk about the normal traditional scanner on a tripod kind of stuff here. That scanner captured what it could see within where the scanner was set up. They run 360 degrees, almost 360 degrees vertical, but it's only one scan. Any project is going to be multiple different scans that are taken. Once they're back in the office, even though some of this can be done in the field now, but typically you're going to bring it back to the office and you have to post-process the data. This means we're going to take those individual scans and combine them into one big point cloud of the site. This process, what the important part to remember about this is that this process exists and it takes time. So you won't go from, on scanning on site to a point cloud in your inbox in an hour, right? It's depending on the size of the project. This could take a day for something small, like this image shows on the screen. This would be post-processed in a day. To the largest projects we do, you could be talking about weeks or even a month before you actually get the final scan data published out. And then we're going to get into the outputs. So we've created this point cloud. We've aligned it to your site, to your building grid or a building corner or something. And now we have to do something with it, or you have to do something with it. So the point cloud itself is just a bunch of dots, and that's one of the potential deliverables. The other would be, CAD data or BIM data, and then, report or analysis analytical data. Right? So when we talk about point clouds, just want to remember if you were to hire someone to just do a scan, what you're going to get is you're going to get a point cloud. That point cloud should be aligned and you should be able to reference it into, Revit, AutoCAD, or whatever you happen to be using. And then you can draw and model on top of it. But it is just a bunch of dots. Um, what you can do with those dots is somewhat limited. You can put them onto drawings. You can use them as kind of as-built documentation, but typically, depending on what your scope is, you're going to need to do something with those dots to turn them into some kind of model geometry. Right? The dots alone are just that, they're just the points. One of the other kind of things that comes out of this is the virtual tours, which is tends to be one of the more important parts of the deliverable, and they're the ones that are actually used by typically everyone on the project. And we'll talk a little more about that on the next slide here. Okay, so the virtual tours are going to be similar to Google Street Views, where you can navigate through the space by clicking, to the next spot, the next spot, the next spot. These represent either where the scanner was set up, or in the case of mobile scanners, where a pano image was taken. And what these are they are photographs, but behind the photograph is the actual point cloud. So where this is different from Google Street View is that there's dimensional data behind the image. And you can take measurements, make annotations, and you can share all that. And these are typically going to be hosted in the cloud. And they can either be hosted by the person that you've hired to do the work. That would be the most common path. Or you can also choose to host them yourself and have your provider upload to a host that you have. These are also typically going to be associated with the type of equipment that was used. So if a Faro unit was used, it's going to go into Faro Sphere. If a Matterport was used, it will go into Matterport solution. Um, and these have different costs, right? So something to keep in mind, in general, your provider is only going to keep these live for a certain amount of time. If they include this at all in the bid, it is going to be time limited. They cannot host these indefinitely for you. And so you may want to consider that when you're negotiating with them, is how long you're going to need these virtual tours made available. So we get into the CAD outputs. This can be CAD, it can be BIM, it can be mesh, it can be 2D, 3D. Um, you know, the thing to keep in mind is this is essentially tracing over the dots. Like I said, we're not going to talk a lot about this because this is really a whole separate topic than what we're going over today. But just know that this is a thing, it's a step that typically needs to happen on all of these projects. There, of course, are projects that stay in the point cloud, some VDC type work, things like that. But if you're doing maybe a traditional, um, maybe you're an architect and you're doing a design and you need the as-built so you can start your new work, you're going to need a model developed from the point cloud. And that can either be done by a service provider. It doesn't have to be the same one that did the scanning. It could be bid out separately. Um, and it can take a lot of people to do larger buildings. Smaller, not a big deal, but larger buildings can consume a huge amount of time and hours to do. And just to give you some perspective on this, these are the typical requests that we see. About 45% of the requests are going to be they want the virtual tours and a BIM model delivered. Um, about 30% virtual tours and 2D CAD of some kind, right? It could be as simple as basic floor plans or maybe a complete design set of 2D with the elevations, reflected ceilings, and all that. Um, Rare is going to be just point cloud and virtual tour delivered, where the someone else is doing the modeling, and then other, which would be the other things I alluded to, right? Analysis, maybe floor flatness reviews, things like that, or VDC consulting, so stuff like collision checking, progress monitoring, plumbness of walls, all those types of things that you do, kind of the analysis side of the business. That move on to our next section. A couple, what can happen if your RFQ is not good, if your request for quote is poor. Um, so we see, somewhere around 300 to 500 RFQs per year that come through. And they range from, here PMC will do, if it's local, we'll do single family homes up to 10 million square foot manufacturing plants. So everywhere in between we do. Um, it's shocking that most have no quantifiable requirement other than cost. So how these folks know what they're actually getting is kind of a mystery. And they lack sometimes even the most basic information about the site. We'll get a request, an email will come in, I just need my factory scanned, and that's it. They don't give even an address for the factory. They have no information about the site, right? These are difficult things to bid. Right? So a couple, just to reinforce why you don't want to issue a poor RFQ. We had a manufacturing client come to us, request a bid. We submitted our bid. We tend to be pretty competitive, and we found out that we lost, we by 90%. Someone came in at 10% of our price. And we really had some questions as far as how that could be possible. And what ended up happening and what we bid is per the specification, the requirement was to scan every level of a paint shop. It was to do it using terrestrial laser scanners. It was to capture all the information, both inside and outside of the equipment, and again, on all levels. The bid that ended up winning was for mobile scanning with no secondary control or survey control, and they only had accounted for a single floor. Um, what the client ended up getting was simply not usable and not remotely what they needed. And if you get bids, right, the lesson we learned here is one, you should get multiple bids, which is good. And then if anyone is a crazy outlier like that, you should assume there's some kind of problem. You should have some kind of meeting to determine why they were an outlier. Or if you, let's say, got four bids and three are pretty common and one's an outlier, you can pretty safely ignore the outlier. Um, then another one, this was actually for the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., the Natural History Museum. And we lost this bid again, and we got a call from the architect about 6 months later. Turns out that what we had put in our quote, we had quoted, I believe it was around 6,000 scans to do the museum, plus all the underground stuff that's part of the museum. The provider they had picked only had budgeted for 3,000, came back with an extra to do another 3,000. And then on top of that, the data wasn't stitching together correctly. Again, because they had broke that rule of large jobs must have secondary control. Um, so we got the call to come in and try to fix it. In this case, we actually ended up refusing to do the work because the scan quality was so poor that it just was not something that could be fixed. The job needed to be done over again. Um, and this is very unfortunate because a lot of money had been spent and 6 months had been spent, maybe even more important than the money. And it just wasn't workable information. It could not be made to work. This is even more critical in mobile scanning. So in terrestrial scanning, you can almost always, unless it's catastrophically bad, you can almost always get something that kind of sort of works. Maybe you can get it to plus minus 6 inches, which is maybe good enough to sort of as-built a building. Um, if you screw up mobile scanning, it cannot be fixed. It can be off by multiple feet, and there's no way to fix it. Um, and so then, lastly, the number one issue we see is people trying to do jobs that are too large and they're not doing that secondary survey. We see this all the time. I would say at least once a month, we get contacted by someone hoping we can fix a job where this is what happened. They just try to do something too large without doing that secondary survey control. And I understand why. I understand the drive to do this. It makes it cheaper if you don't have to do that secondary control. And exactly where that cutoff is hard to nail down, right? Sometimes, we can do 100,000 square feet without it and get usable data. But if we show up at an open warehouse that's 100,000 square feet, we can't do it. We have to do that secondary survey. And so exactly when that needs to be brought in and when that extra cost needs to be absorbed is something that comes through a lot of experience and understanding the site. Yeah. That will move on to our next section about tips for subcontracting projects. Hey, uh, the number one thing, and we say this, if it's a relatively normal project, you can just send us a PDF of the area marked up and say this is what we want scanned, and we can probably get you an accurate bid based on that. You don't need to know what city it's in, but other than that, we can get you a bid. Um, we don't need a ton of information. The more information you give us, right, the more confidence we have in the project, and therefore the better the price we can give you on the project. And that's going to be the same, obviously I'm talking about us, but this is the same for any supplier that's out there. And then there's a few special things to consider that we'll talk about here in a minute. Right? So like the absolute basics, let's say you have no floor plans at all. You just have nothing. So we're going to need, the building address. And we can look that up in Google Earth and we can even figure out the square footage roughly. Right. But keep in mind, if we have to do that, right, when we draw that little box in Google Earth, we're going to draw it pretty big. And we're probably going to come in, 10%, 20% above what the actual square foot of the building is. Because we don't want to risk being under and not having allocated enough time to do the job. Um, but we can do that, right? This happens a lot. One of the reasons we get called in is because there is no existing documentation. Number of floors, again, this can be important if it's a rural area and Google Earth doesn't have 3D of the building or even Street View where we can figure out how many floors there are in the building. Sometimes with the address, we can pull tax records and things and get this information, but not always. Um, it's nice to know the approximate number of rooms per floor. Or you can say things like it's a generic office space or a generic school space, and we have a good idea what that is. Lastly, the approximate age of the building. Again, this is going to be important if there's not street view and we can't get any information really about the building. Because if it tends to be a much older building, that's going to fall into our historic, especially this really affects modeling cost more than scanning cost. If it's 100-year-old building and it's still standing, there's a very good chance it's a historic building, and that's going to take more time to model. It's not necessarily going to take more time to scan, but it will take more time to model. Right. Some other things to consider, right? Are we doing just the interior? Are we doing the exterior? Are we doing the roof? Those types of things. In general, nowadays, the roof is almost always going to be done with a drone and not with people climbing on the roof. This is for safety reasons. It's also just cheaper to do it with a drone. Um, is the area currently occupied? This is a big one that can have minimal effect or a dramatic effect. Um, so for us, occupied residential, very difficult. Occupied medical, about as difficult as it gets for our type of work. Because you can't just, barge into someone's apartment and scan it. And if you're doing a building with 200 apartment units in it, who's going to get us into all of those apartments? And can they do it? If we're doing something like mobile scanning, we can be in and out of each apartment in 2 or 3 minutes. Is someone going to be able to open the doors that successively fast? Or are we going to drag this job out and it's going to take us an hour per unit instead of 2 or 3 minutes? Right? This has a huge impact on cost. Um, but even if it's, manufacturing, let's say, can we scan it while the business is running? Or do we have to do it after hours on holidays, those types of things? Um, are there access requirements? For us, the biggest thing is, are we just going to get unrestricted access to the space, or are we going to have to be escorted? And if we're escorted, will that escort be able to move through the space as quickly as we are, or will they not? Right, again, this is going to slow things down or speed things up. Uh, is a reliable 120-volt power? Do we need to bring a generator to charge batteries? This is a question we need to understand. Obviously, we can't bring a gas generator on an airplane, so this affects, the cost again. Working lighting available. We can scan in pitch black. We can bring our own lights. That's fine. But these things just add cost to the job, right? We've got to mobilize more equipment, more gear, get more stuff out there. Um, Working restrooms, right? This is one we've been burnt on a few times, especially in urban areas where uh, businesses outside of our scope area are going to be hostile to people using their restroom. This can tie up a lot of time, right? Where we have to, someone's got to go walk back to their car. They got to secure the equipment. They got to walk back to their car, drive to an off-site restroom somewhere. Um, Special training. We especially run into this in like manufacturing and industrial environments. Do you need us to capture information up high that's obstructed from the ground? So scanners have huge range that if we're doing interior work, the shortest range of scanners nowadays is, 70 meters. Um, so we can capture everything up high unless there's like things blocking our view, right? A scanner can't go through anything. It's a line of sight tool. So do we need to bring in, lift equipment to get up above something to see down on top of it? We need to know that because all that's got to be budgeted. Right. Lastly, some high cost items. Abnormal safety hazards. This is a big one. If we walk into your site, all of our guys are trained enough to recognize asbestos. If we walk in and we find asbestos and it's not properly contained, we're going to immediately leave the site and send you a bill for everything up to that point. Make sure you know what's going on your site. Don't send us in somewhere that's not safe without talking about it first. If we talk about it first, we can budget for it. It's not a problem at all. We have not found an environment yet we can't work in. But we just need to discuss it before we go out there. Um, are there concerns with interiors of elevator shafts or anything else like that? Where we're going to have to lock out the equipment. We may have to get, maintenance people involved to open things up. Those types of things, right? We need to talk about that. They're very difficult from a scanning perspective. Again, we can do it. We just need to talk about it ahead of time and make sure we have a good plan in place. And then lastly, probably the most common high cost impact is active ceiling or drop ceilings. If you need us to scan above those, what it boils down to is that we can scan the floor level for every 1 hour of basic floor level scanning to cover that same area above drop ceiling. You can expect an additional 2.5 hours on site. So, if we were to come out and we were to scan a high school, let's say, and we were going to be out there 200 hours to do the floor level, right? You should expect us an additional 500 hours to do above drop ceiling. I think I did that math right. Yeah. Right. So 200 hours to just do the floor level, an additional 500 to do above drop ceiling. There's ways to reduce that. There's ways to talk that back and make it more reasonable. We can do panoramic images instead of scans, a lot of different things we can do. But again, don't have us bid on just doing the floor level and then say, oh, but we need it above drop ceiling at the end. Critical and very critical that if you were to send out an RFQ to get quotes, that you specify that. And the more you can lock down how much drop ceiling you have, the better, right? Don't say that it's 100,000 square foot building and just assume it's 100,000 above drop ceiling. It seldom is, right? There's going to be a lot of hard deck in there. And, every 1,000 square feet you can chop off what you're asking us to do is going to save you money. We can also cut holes in hard deck. We've done that a bunch too, and get information above that as well. Again, needs to be discussed and planned out ahead of time. Right. Request some quantifiable objectives in the bids you're asking for. Some basics would be how many scans are you going to do? Assuming you're requesting traditional scanning. Um, Even though if you're requesting mobile scanning, this basically changes to how many panos are you going to do? What type of equipment will you use? You don't want to get in a situation where you were expecting maybe traditional laser scanning and a provider went out with a Matterport. Um, these are two different types of equipment, two different deliverables you're going to get. Matterport's going to be a lot cheaper, but the data quality is going to be lower. Certainly is suitable for a lot of work. We do a lot of Matterport work, but it's not good for every site and not appropriate. Um, and then what are the deliverables, right? So you're going to list your deliverables, hopefully in your RFQ, right? That we want the scan data, we want 12 months of virtual tour hosting, and we want a complete BIM model with some spec about the BIM model. You should expect that at least your verbiage is sent back to you in the quote, and hopefully more elaborate, right? Hopefully with a more detailed, especially on the modeling. I know I said we won't talk about today, but a more detailed list of what they're going to provide and not provide in the model, because that can have a pretty big cost impact. You should demand a schedule of some kind, right? It doesn't need to be the schedule we tend to send out is very basic, but it tells you, how many days we think we're going to be at your site, which is going to be critical information for you because you have to plan access. And if you have to have one of your people there with us, right, you need to know how much that's going to be. And it just breaks down days on site, days to post process, and days to model. All right. If it's a huge project, you may want a more detailed schedule that itemizes out different areas or zones and how they're all going to flow to you over time in a sequence. But for smaller stuff, a really basic schedule should just be part of the response you get from any supplier. Require some kind of sample quality report. And this stuff's auto-generated for the most part by any of the software out there that they're doing the post-processing in. And you don't need to know how to read this at all or understand it, but asking for that is a way of at least identifying if the people you're requesting a quote from know even that quality reports exist. And if they don't, they might not be the best pick for you, right? So again, just having it and asking for an example of it can help kind of filter, are the people you're talking to, do they know what they're doing? This is more important the larger the project gets. The smaller the projects are, they're pretty easy and almost anyone can do it. And like I said, if you're using a terrestrial, you can always fix it, especially if it's only a couple thousand square feet. Then you might want to request, again, as the jobs get a little bigger, a more thorough explanation of what they do to control quality. Right. Some stuff you're going to want to request as the jobs get bigger. Preliminary scan map. Where do you think, and you're going to do scans. And if this is a huge job, please don't ask us to do it on everything. Pick a sample area and say, hey, do a scan map in zone A. Where are you going to set up the scanner, do you think? Or if you're using mobile, where do you think you're going to walk? Draw a preliminary path. What kind of settings they're going to use. So not just what hardware are they going to use, but what settings on the hardware are they going to use. You could ask for proof of certification that they're maintaining their equipment and that it's up to specs. A fully documented QA plan, references, and example projects that are similar. For the example projects and point clouds, this is a little tricky because the data is huge and it's hard to move around. But certainly they should be able to share a smaller example or a section of an example project with you. And just understand that as you increase the request and you add more things to it, you're going to force out maybe some of the more independent people out there. And if you have a small job, your best pricing is going to come from the smaller independent people, right? They just have a lower cost structure. So don't put all of these in, a single family home capture, right? You're just going to push a bunch of smaller guys out who could offer you probably the best price and will deliver just fine. Um, Being clear on your deliverables. This is a big one. Um, you know, it's not, especially nowadays, it's not just scanning. Scanning has the market for what could be loosely considered scanning, or more broadly like reality capture, has fractured into a lot of different equipment, a lot of different techniques. Um, and it's actually a good thing overall because it means we can target the right equipment to get you the right deliverable at the best price. In other words, we're not just coming out with the terrestrial scanner on every job and it's just this is what we do, even if you don't need that level of accuracy. Um, so let's define really what you need. Asking for unnecessary deliverables. For example, be realistic about the accuracy you need. Um, do you really need an eighth of an inch? Is a quarter fine? Is an inch good? Right? Be realistic about what you need here because it can make a big impact on cost. Again, because it will depend on what type of gear and equipment is sent to the site to do the job. Um, if you specify all this and then, the supplier comes back proposing alternatives, you need to look at that carefully and have, if you're not a very technical person, hopefully you have a technical person on your team that can evaluate those alternatives and understand, what that will mean to your project, right? And is it an acceptable alternative? Sometimes it very well might be. Other times you could end up with data that doesn't meet your requirements of what you need. Lastly, don't forget um, to enforce your contractual requirements. So if you have specific insurance requirements, if you have NDAs that need to be passed through, um, if you have even more complex, especially on like government work, can have really complicated requirements. Make sure not to forget to pass these through. Uh, Again, you don't want to drop some, strange, abnormal insurance requirement on a company after you've already gotten the bids back, right? Anyone out there doing business should have basic insurance, but if that particular project requires, 10 million instead of 1 million in coverage, make sure you pass that on ahead of time because that obviously is going to be a cost. Right. Um, so a few things just to keep in mind before we move on to larger projects. We'll talk about costing more in the last section here. Processing can take a lot of time. uh, Especially, even on medium-sized jobs, a couple 100,000 square feet, make sure you allocate for that. Like I said, you're not going to get the point cloud the day after the person leaves the site on those jobs. It's going to take time. And a lot of times people don't understand that. Quality mistakes, especially again, even on the medium-sized jobs or even on the smaller, right? They can cost days. So the most common quality mistakes we see are misalignment of data. So one scan attached to the other scan and they're not connected correctly, and you'll see a shift in the data. And then the second most common is that they're not properly geolocated to your existing CAD data. So that when you bring this thing into Revit or you bring it into AutoCAD, let's say you're doing the modeling, the point cloud shoots way out in space. Um, if those things aren't done right, the problem is that it took a bunch of time to make those things wrong. To make them correct, we have to go all the way back to the beginning and reprocess the data all the way through. Again, if it's a single family home, something like that, you maybe lose a day or two. If it's a medium-sized project, you lose a week. If it's a big project, you could lose a month. Um, so make sure that these things are communicated properly and that you don't have these quality mistakes. Lastly, good subcontractors you hire are going to deliver quality data on time most of the time. At the end of the day, this is still pretty complicated stuff we're doing. It's very large data sets. Mistakes do happen. I wish they didn't. You can have things like equipment failures. You can have the best planning on earth, and sometimes there's still problems on jobs. And when there is, it can cost some time. and it's hard to go back and fix. Again, a good subcontractor is going to go back and fix that. They're going to make sure you get what you need at no cost to you, but just understand occasionally there are mistakes that happen. Hey, real quick, just a few large projects. I've alluded to this a lot in our discussion, but large projects are different. Um, when you get to a project that's in excess of value of $50,000 just for the scanning, you should consider some much bigger requirements. One being there's a trade group for all of us in this business called USIBD. They have some documentation out there that's very thorough. It will let you more clearly define exactly what you want for different scope areas. Uh, it just takes a lot more effort to fill out. But again, you're spending a bunch of money. Take the time maybe and fill that out because it could save you on these huge jobs tens of thousands of dollars. Um, if it's again, all this is for large projects, verify references. Never take for granted that a company you've contacted can do a large project. They are just different. And the consequences are higher, they're harder to do. Just verify their references, that they can prove to you that they have done these in the past and that it went, pretty well. Um, Definitely at this stage, request proof that they have a quality assurance plan internally. And lastly, what is their data security and backup plan? How are they protecting essentially your data? And what is their guarantee on that? How long will they keep it for you? How will they transfer it to you? In the past, I've heard of jobs where, a week or 2 weeks worth of scanning data was lost because it was being kept on one external hard drive. That's totally unacceptable on a large job, right? And they need to prove to you they have some kind of plan for how they're going to do that, right? That they're doing duplicated backing up. Um, Real quick from our point of view, right? Our guys go out in the field and they capture data every night when they get back to the hotel. They have to take it's an SD card in the scanners or a hard drive in the mobile units. That data has to be archived twice every night. So it goes to their computer, a copy gets saved on their laptop, a copy gets saved on a USB drive, and then the laptop and the USB drive can never be kept in the same piece of luggage, right? And so there's a whole process we have to make sure that we never lose that data, right? Again, this is important because doing this correct represents a large cost item for us as suppliers. And it's an easy way to save money to take shortcuts here, but it puts your job at risk. And again, on smaller jobs, if it's a reputable provider, they can go out and fix it. It's not the end of the world if they lose your data. It's not good, but if you have a big job, this can be catastrophic because you can lose months. Right. Lastly, we're going to jump into some, real numbers. Again, these are going to be based on what we charge, which I think is pretty in line with the industry as a whole. Um, Obviously we don't always see competitive bids and everything, but these are the numbers as far as what we actually bid on projects. Right? Um, so like I was saying, where above ceiling is separated out over here. But basic scanning, of an empty warehouse space can range from as little as 3 cents a square foot up to about 9 cents a square foot. Um, Office space, dorm space, schools, pretty, basic commercial spaces, um, anywhere from 6 to 12 cents, and that's going to vary by how broken up the space is, right? How many small rooms are there? For example, like actually an elementary school is a little more than a high school because the rooms are bigger in a high school than an elementary school. And each room just drives more scans that have to be done. Um, Lab and medical space, these get more complicated, typically run into more access restrictions. And again, these are for traditional projects, right? It would not be uncommon at all for a hospital emergency room to go into the dollars per square foot. If it requires like specialized containment units and all that. Um, but for normal, like a doctor's office, right, where we can go in after hours and bang it out, we're going to be, 9 to 15 cents a square foot. Um, Industrial, that 4 to 10 cents a square foot. Again, this can vary quite a bit and it can go higher, depending if it's multiple levels and if we need to bring in lift equipment and things like that. And then, of course, above drop ceiling, you'll notice it's not actually, 2.5 times the cost because a lot of our costs is just the initial mobilization, the data processing, all that stuff doesn't change for above drop ceiling. It's just the time on site increases. And so, you're going to range between 12 and 20 cents additional. So it's assuming, basic office space, you're already at the 6 to 12, you're going to pay an additional 12 cents a square foot to pick up the above drop ceiling space. With mobile scanning, so I didn't mention this before. We were talking about the traditional tripod-based scanner. Now we're talking about mobile scanning. Key point before we talk about this, on larger jobs, this requires that a control network be built before scanning is done, and that's not included in these prices. That's a one-time price per site, and that's why it's not included in here because it can be reused over and over again. Hey, but warehouse space, super cheap. Once that control network's in, we can fly through the space and be in and out quick. Same with offices and dorms. Lab and medical equipment can actually still get up there and be expensive, really depending on what, we're doing. Um, and then industrial space can also be pretty affordable and much cheaper. Um, And then right now, above drop ceiling is just not applicable to mobile. You can see the device over on the right there, right? We're not sticking that thing above a ceiling tile. That is changing. There's a new version of this that came out that's cheaper and smaller, that's handheld. So we're testing that out. We might be doing above drop ceiling with mobile as well. I'm not sure if it's going to have a huge price impact or not. Hey, and I know I said we won't talk about modeling, but I feel like we got to put something in here to just show all this. Because most you saw on the table earlier, most projects include modeling of some kind with it too. So these are just numbers for a full BIM model, Revit model being delivered. And I won't go through all these. You can obviously see, what they are, but they're all cumulative, with the exception of architectural and historic architecture. You would pay one or the other, not both. It wouldn't be cumulative. Um, and historic architecture number is for really historic buildings. Most buildings are going to fall somewhere between those two numbers, between normal and historic. Um, and then you add for different things, right? Structural is a complicated one. And this number really assumes that there is 2D documents available that can be used to reconstruct the structure because most of the structure is going to be hidden behind the finished space. In the case where we don't have those documents, then there is no structural charge. It's part of the architectural model where it's exposed and it's not going to be more. MEP can range wildly depending on the level of detail we're going to, and how much detail we're putting in. And then in the case of, certain spaces, right, this obviously isn't applicable necessarily in schools, but are we doing the equipment on the floor? So industrial manufacturing, are we, modeling all the machines and conveyors and all the stuff that fills a factory? And obviously that's going to be more money. Okay. And with that, that actually wraps up what I had for today. I hope everyone learned some stuff, and I hope it was at least remotely informative. And of course, we can share anything you saw today. We had some screenshots from our standard, information form. We're happy to share that form with anyone that wants it. Um, yeah, and then with that, I don't know if there was any questions that came in, or
There
if you
were.
have.
You have a
Yep.
couple here.
Yep.
I did answer this one, but just to re-clarify, what does it mean to go from point cloud to Revit? What are those two things, if you can describe them briefly?
Yeah, so we touched on this a little bit, but and this is where a lot of people get caught up, and it can be a problem. So point clouds are just dots, and it's millions and millions and millions of dots. And so it can look really good, and it can look like a photograph, and you can do things like mesh it, apply a mesh to it, and you can move it around a little bit. But let's talk about an actual use case that you have a historic building and you're going to gut it out and you're going to put in, turn it into new tenant spaces. At some point in that process, you can't use the point cloud to get to your construction documents. That's not going to work. Um, you're going to have to make a model of it. And that work, there are some tools out there, and without getting too deep into it, that kind of automate it. But for the most part, think of it as tracing. So we see on a wall in a building, we'll see a million little dots. And that's not an exaggeration. There might really be a million points on that wall. We're going to take in Revit and we're going to draw a wall down those points, right? And then we're slowly going to build up this model based on what we see in the point cloud. Um, and the main reason for that, right, is because you can't issue the point cloud generally as a construction document, and you can't add a lot of new geometry to the point cloud. Of course, there's exceptions, and anyone that knows a lot about this is maybe calling me a liar right now, but yeah, I understand you can do all these things, but in most workflows for most customers for us, they need some kind of CAD, and they can certainly do that CAD or BIM on their own. But understand, depending on the size of the project, this can be very labor intensive. Um, and so you can, either do it on your own, you could bid it out separately. There's a lot of ways you could get to that. But if your main workflow is to design a new building or to extend an existing building, you're probably going to need some level of BIM and CAD development to do that. And it is a separate process from the scanning. That was very long-winded. I hope that helped.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Um, so another question from Neil. Above dropped ceiling, if there's no dropped ceiling, but we need to scan exposed MEP FP systems, is that an additional cost above base scanning?
Nope. Nope. From scanning perspective, it's no additional cost at all. The scanner sees everything. Same as like historic buildings, it really doesn't change our price for scanning, only modeling. And same with MEP, it will affect the modeling or CAD work. It will not affect the scanning price.
Um, Next question for you. Do you have any idea what the cost per square foot to complete the Revit conversion is for the architect if they don't want to do it in-house?
Yep. That was a slide right before. And then I think we actually have a web page up now, don't we, Veronica? That also
Do.
has that info on it.
Yes. I can drop that in the chat here shortly.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's here. That's the first column here. Right. Obviously, it varies, right, depending on the complexity of the project and what's in and out of scope.
Okay.
Yeah.
And let's see. Um, can you explain what geolocation is?
Yeah. So in this context, it's where the point cloud exists within digital space. So typically this is going to be a building column if the columns are exposed. Let's say it's column A1, or it's going to be the southwest corner of the building. What we need to know is the center of that column or the corner of the building. where do you want that to show up in Revit? And if you have if no existing data is out there at all, you can just say, yeah, make that 0.00 and we're good. We'll make that 0.00. If you have some kind of existing Revit or CAD information, and I don't know, that column is at 1000, 1000, right? We need to know that so that we move the point cloud um, into the correct location so that when you reference it into Revit or AutoCAD, it will drop right on top of your existing model. And this is very important. You do not want to arbitrarily be trying to move a point cloud around in Revit. This causes a lot of problems. You always want to bring it in origin to origin and pin it right there and never move it. Um, if you're moving it, it's just going to cause problems over the life of the project. So the geolocation is just making sure that our point cloud data lines up with any existing CAD data you might have so that it works together.
Real quick, one last question here. Can you scan the surrounding, such as landscape? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we didn't talk a lot about we have a different presentation on choices in reality capture where we talk more about this, but typically that type of work is done with a drone and photogrammetry mixed with limited site control. And ultimately what it means is that entire sites can be done for really inexpensive, and then modeled up. And from a PMC plug here, we are not licensed surveyors, so we cannot do anything that requires a license in that space. You'd have to hire someone else. Um, but like rough site layouts, like you said, topography, if you just want to site the building and you know where your property lines are, yeah, it's super easy, very inexpensive with a drone.
Okay, that was their next question, was to give them a ballpark on the cost.
I mean, even a large site would only be a few $1,000s. Um, if it's local, it could be sub 1,000 to do that.
Okay, fair
Yeah.
enough. Alrighty, guys, we've gone over time. So thank you very much for attending our webinar today. Again, we'll email you a recording and issue your AAA CEUs as soon as possible. Thank you again so much. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.